Hello and welcome to Hebrew Perspectives. This week's Torah portion is Vayera, which has to do with the binding of Isaac. We as believers know the typology of Genesis chapter 22 and all the parallels that we see. We see that he was begotten, he was promised. Genesis 22 is called the Akedah in Hebrew. 7 days it is read in morning prayer service. It is also read on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. And it is read once during the regular reading cycle, which is actually this week. So in all total it is read 367 times. It is the most read and cherished chapter in the Bible to the Jews. Genesis 22 is amazing with all that we see in it. The sacrifice, the ram caught in the thicket. Let's look a little closer at some things here. In Hendrickson's literal translation of Hebrews 11:17-19, it says, "By faith, being tested, Abraham offered up Isaac, reckoning that God was able to raise him from the dead, from where indeed he obtained him in a parable." Now, what parable is the writer of Hebrews talking about? In what parable did Abraham obtain Isaac from the dead? Now the NIV says it, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. There's even rabbinic literature on this. Now let's look at that a little bit closer. Rabbi Judah says, when the sword touched Isaac's throat, we often look and we see that those pictures of Abraham standing over Isaac and he's going to plunge it into his heart and sacrifice him. That's not how it was done. All animals were sacrificed. All sacrifices were done with the sling of throat. So it was, death is instantaneously. But when the sword touched Isaac's throat, Rabbi Judah says that his soul flew clean out of him. And when he let his voice, as in talking about God, be heard from between the cherubim, "Lay not thy hand upon the lad's soul was returned to his body. Then his father unbound him, and Isaac arose, knowing that in this way the dead would come back to life in the future. Whereupon he began to recite, 'Blessed are you, Lord, who resurrects the dead.'" Because Jewish tradition and rabbinic writings treat Isaac as if he actually died upon the altar, Isaac became an early symbol for resurrection. Now the Midrash goes on further and it says and emphasizes a connection between Isaac and his Akedah. Akedah in Hebrew is the binding and the resurrection, even going as far as to state that on Isaac's merit all the dead will be resurrected in the future. Interesting, if we're comparing Isaac to Jesus. By virtue of Isaac, who offered himself as a sacrifice on top of the altar, the Holy One, blessed be He, will resurrect the dead in the future, as it is said in Psalms 102:21. To hear the groaning of him who is bound, to open up release for the offspring appointed to death. Him who is bound is interpreted as Isaac on top of the altar. To open up release for this offspring appointed to death is interpreted as the dead whose graves the Holy One, blessed be He, will open up so that He may set them on their feet in the age to come. Now, interestingly enough, the half-Torah portion for this week has to do with resurrection also. It's the story in 2 Kings 4:1-37. It's the story of the death of the Shunammite's son and his miraculous resurrection at Elisha's hand. Both stories are about boys prophetically promised to barren women who subsequently died and were miraculously restored. But did Isaac really die? Probably not. But is definitely a concept well cemented in the early traditions of parables of rabbinic Judaism. Now, it's interesting that we talk a little bit about resurrection because they even believe something about the ram. The ram's horns. It is believed that the left horn was used at Sinai for giving the Torah, and the right horn will be used to herald the arrival of the Messiah. There's a slight problem, though. Wasn't the ram burnt in the burnt offering, with its horns and its skin and everything? How could this be the source of the shofar that was blown at Mount Sinai? Of course, rabbinic literature has an answer for that. Rabbi Bachai says the answer is that God created a new ram out of the ashes. How can the horn from Isaac's ram be horn that heralded the Messiah when the ram was completely burned? The answer is simple. The ram is resurrected. Genesis 22:8. And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering." So they went, both of them together. Speaking of Abraham's ram, there's an interesting textual problem around the description of this ram. It is an anomalous grammatical form in verse 13, which has caused many a rabbi to scratch his head. The verse literally reads in the Hebrew, "And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a ram after caught in the thicket." The word achar is best translated as after. Its appearance in the text here seems somewhat clumsy and misplaced. In order to explain this, several possible interpretations have been made. Now, the most widely accepted is in the King James Version, which renders the sentence, "And behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket." Now, the sages struggle with this word. Does it mean that the ram was behind Abraham? One commentator suggests that it means that the ram was caught in the thicket only after Abraham saw it. Another says that it was after the preceding events that Abraham saw the ram. Still another opinion is that Abraham saw the Acharet Yomim, or the last days. There are still other explanations, and all of them are possible, but none seem completely satisfactory. The question is, where and when did Abraham see the ram? More literally, the construction of the sentence implies that he saw the lamb afterwards. Some believers have suggested that perhaps it is a reference to a prophetic vision. Perhaps what is being implied is that when Abraham looked up, he not only saw this ram caught in the thicket, but he also saw a future sacrifice that would come long after his day. Where did and when did Abraham see the ram? Jesus makes a statement about Abraham, about what Abraham saw. And he says in the Gospel of John, in 8:5-6, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." What did Abraham see? Perhaps he saw the lamb God provided. Perhaps he saw Jesus. It is recorded in the Mishnah, in the sayings of the fathers, that this particular ram was created for this purpose since the first days of creation. In other words, Isaac's ram was prepared for a fat sacrifice since the foundation of the world. In the same way that Peter described Jesus as a lamb without blemish or defect, chosen before the creation of the world, in 1 Peter 1:19 and 20. There are more parables and stories about the Akedah. The Midrash is full of them. Some are well known and remembered even today. Some are more obscure. For example, consider the manner in which the Midrash attempts to resolve the question of Isaac's absence at the end of this Genesis narrative in chapter 22. The Torah reads in verse number 19 of 22 Genesis, "So Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba." Now, in the same stark, simple language with which it began, the Torah concludes the story of the Akedah by stating that Abraham returned to his servants, and they went together to Beersheba. Conspicuously absent is Isaac. Why does the Torah not say Abraham and Isaac returned? Emphatically stated that Abraham and Isaac went together. Twice in the beginning of that chapter, that they went together. But here at the conclusion of the passage, Abraham returns all by himself, alone. Isaac is not seen in the Torah again until he meets his bride, Rebekah. So here you have sort of a death, a burial, a resurrection, and then a going away. Isaac goes away, and then you don't see him again until he takes his bride. Interesting. It is believed that Isaac returned. Many people believe that, or some people believe that he went and he studied under Melchizedek. But no one has really known for sure. But what does Akedah mean? The word is actually derived from the Hebrew verb achod, translated as bound. In verse number 9, it is an unusual word. Achod literally means ringed or striped. Rashi explains that the use of this verb refers to the stripe-like marks that were left by the ropes on the ankles and the wrists of a person who has been tied hand and foot. A person bound in this manner would bear the impression of the ropes on their skin. It is from this particular verb, achod, that we derive the word Akedah. Therefore, the entire story is named after the marks left on Isaac's body. Akedah is the binding. Even the skeptic will have to admit that the messianic foreshadowing down to the choice of a single word is astounding. Was it not Jesus who was bound for sacrifice in such manner that his wrists and ankles were marked, even scarred for all eternity? Thank you for watching Hebrew Perspectives.